Can you name a similarity between Apple, Google, Nvidia, Cisco, and Oracle? Well, yes, they're all multi-hundred billion dollar Fortune 100 companies, but they were also all funded by Sequoia Capital. Sequoia has also funded Dashlane, Doordash, GitHub, Instagram, PayPal, Reddit, SpaceX, Square, WhatsApp, Yahoo, YouTube, Zoom, and all of these other companies as well. In fact, the combined market cap of all Sequoia Capital companies is a whopping $3.3 trillion, and that was as of July of 2019. Since then, Apple alone has reached a market cap of $3 trillion, so it's safe to say that Sequoia's aggregated market cap is well over $5 trillion today, even with the stock market crash. And all of those are just a compilation of Sequoia's known investments. Sequoia has dozens of undisclosed investments that will likely stay undisclosed indefinitely. Considering this, many would argue that Sequoia is by far the most successful VC firm of all time, and that's not a very controversial statement, but it's not all sunshines and rainbows. While it's cool to say that you've been involved in all of these companies, the reality is that to get here, there's way more failures. In fact, 75% of all VC-backed startups fail, so for every apple they score, they have to deal with 3 wannabe apples who end up consuming tens of millions each. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that when you're making so many investments, it's only a matter of time until you invest in someone who's truly evil. Their most recent slip-up was none other than FTX, in which they had a total of $150 million. Some of their other controversial and borderline fraudulent investments include BarthPay, Trell, and Zillingo. But despite the roaring highs and humiliating lows, it seems like Sequoia has cracked the code. They've been operating for over 50 years, invested in 1,800 companies, and they've essentially funded the entirety of Silicon Valley. So here's the story of Sequoia Capital, the architects of Silicon Valley. Taking a look back, the story of Sequoia Capital traces its roots back to a stern man named Don Valentine. Don was born on June 26, 1932 in Manhattan, New York, during the worst of the Great Depression. Don didn't have a very strong background either. His father was a regular old milkman, and his mother was a homemaker, so grit and hardship was something that he got used to very early on. He would end up attending Fort Dam University, where he majored in chemistry, before moving to Southern California in the 1950s. This was during the height of the Cold War, so the defense industry was popping off, and Don would get a job as a sales engineer at Raytheon, but he didn't really want to be here. You see, Don lived by the ideology that the past is wrong. If you want to make truly great investments, you have to do something that's not part of the past, to do something entirely different. From Don's perspective, the something that was completely different was obvious. It was silicon wafers. He didn't really understand the technical side of these gadgets, but he knew he wanted to be a part of this industry. So he joined Fairchild Semiconductor as one of their first salesmen and ended up becoming a star. He would basically build out their entire sales department over the next 7 years. In fact, he did such a great job that he would be offered an executive role at one of Fairchild's spin-off companies, National Semiconductor. He would happily take the job, but it wasn't long until he started having arguments with his superiors. You see, Don felt that it was stupid that they were selling boatloads of wafers to certain companies, but not investing in said companies. He tried to convince leadership to try their hand at investing, but the answer was always no. At first, Don accepted their reluctance, but the more time that passed, the more he felt that he was missing out. Don started feeling that the next something was no longer silicon wafers, but the companies that were built on these wafers. So Don began investing his own money into up-and-coming tech companies, which caught the attention of Capital Group. Capital wasn't familiar with the tech scene or startups. They were primarily a mutual fund company. But while they didn't have expertise, what they did have was money, and they wanted Don to invest this money. With that, Don would quit his job and create Sequoia Capital in 1972, using $3 million worth of funding, mostly from capital. The term sequoia alludes to a local tree that's known to live thousands of years, so he chose quite an ambitious name, but Don had to now walk the walk. Fortunately for Don, this wasn't too hard, as his first investment itself would be $600,000 into Atari. Atari would go on to be sold for $28 million to Warner just a few years later, so it was no doubt a great investment. But there was something that made the Atari investment magnitudes better. If you know your Apple history, you probably know that Steve Jobs used to work at Atari. I think you can guess what happened next. Don wasn't the first person that Steve approached. The first person Steve approached was actually the founder of Atari, Nolan Bushnell. He offered Nolan 33% of the company for $50,000, but while Nolan was tempted, he ended up declining and suggested that Steve talk to Don. Don was sold almost immediately. He says that he's only met two visionaries throughout his entire life. The first one was Robert Noyce, a co-founder of Fairchild and later Intel. The second was Steve Jobs. And given that Don has interacted with hundreds of Fortune 500 CEOs, this is really saying something. But by the time Steve reached out to Don, they already had operations underway, and Steve had wisened up regarding how much Apple was really worth. So Don had to invest a much more hefty $150,000 into Apple. And it's not clear how big of a stake this gave him, but that didn't really matter, as he would end up selling just 2 years later for $6 million. That's obviously a phenomenal return of 40x in 2 years, but Don didn't exactly want to sell. The problem was that Don's investors needed their money back for tax purposes, so Don was forced to sell. This was quite a shame, as Don literally had the future world's largest company in his hand, but this taught Don a valuable lesson. Never accept money from non-tax exempt institutions. Don wasn't too disappointed though. He felt that the computer revolution was just getting started, and there was plenty of opportunity left. With that, Don would turn around and invest in Electronic Arts in 1982. He would follow this up with an investment into Oracle in 1983. These were obviously outstanding investments that performed exceptionally well, but Don couldn't help but feel that he just didn't have enough skin in the game. Sure, he was pretty good at investing a few $100,000 and making a few million, or maybe even tens of millions. But there was no way that Sequoia would reach the hundreds of millions or billions if they stuck to this strategy. So Don started looking for companies in which he could gain a much larger stake. This took quite some time, but he eventually found his target, Cisco. In the late 1980s, Cisco was in dire need of money. They had already asked Sequoia for money, but less than a year later, they needed even more money. Cisco was desperate, and let's just say, Don would seize this opportunity. He offered them $2.5 million for 32% of the company, and looking back, this was definitely a predatory offer, but Cisco had no choice but to accept if they wanted to survive. Ironically, this actually worked out super well for Cisco, as Don would bring his expertise in management and sales to Cisco, which allowed them to become the world's largest company by 2000. As for the founders though, well, it didn't work out all that great, but that's a whole nother story. At the peak, Cisco would reach a valuation of $569 billion, so let's just say Sequoia made a crap ton of money. Sequoia was now the world's most well-known and most respected VC firm. But they were just getting started, as they would turn around and invest all of their profits from Cisco into dot-com favorites. Some of the last investments that Don personally led at Sequoia was Nvidia in 1993 and Yahoo in 1995, but this was for the best. You see, Don was extremely self-aware, and he acknowledged that modern companies were way beyond his expertise. He was able to somewhat keep up as long as companies were actually creating physical products like Apple, Cisco, and Nvidia. He could help with manufacturing, suppliers, scaling, and logistics. But more and more promising companies were starting to have no physical product whatsoever, and this was a clear sign to Don that it was time for him to step down. In 1996, Don would hand over Sequoia to two of his most trusted executives, Doug Leone and Michael Moritz. These two were nothing less than absolute professionals. They would not only run Sequoia well, but they would run it exactly how Don had envisioned. For example, in the mid-1990s, the duo started feeling that much of the opportunity was overseas. At first, they considered just doing it themselves, but then they thought about how Don would approach the situation. If it wasn't his expertise, Don wouldn't do it himself, and this was the exact philosophy that Doug and Michael would use overseas. Instead of investing themselves, these two would assemble local teams in these overseas countries, specifically in China and India. And let's just say, this strategy worked out spectacularly. In China, their most notable investments include Alibaba, DJI, JD, Neo, and of course, ByteDance. And here's a list of their hundreds of investments in India. But just because Sequoia was expanding internationally did not mean that they were slacking at home. In fact, they were catching even bigger fish back home. In 1999, they would score Google and PayPal. In 2003, they would score LinkedIn. In 2005, they would score Kayak and YouTube. And in 2009, they would score Dropbox, which brings us to modern times. Over the past 15 years, the world has experienced a mobile revolution which has progressed faster than anyone could have ever imagined. But somehow, Sequoia managed to stay at the leading edge of the mobile revolution as well. Their first notable mobile investment was Airbnb in 2009, where it invested a total of $600,000. They would follow this up with Evernote, Stripe, Tumblr, Square, WhatsApp, Instagram, Instacart, Doordash, Reddit, GitHub, Zoom, Robinhood, Dashlane, Figma, and SpaceX, just to name a few. How are they able to find so many winners, you ask? Well, it's not rocket science, though they do invest in rocket science as well. The secret is simply that they're constantly handing off the torch to newer generations. First, Don passed on the torch to Doug and Michael, who were responsible for many of the .com and international hits. These guys then passed the torch to Jim Goetz, who scored most of their victories throughout the 2000s. And more recently, it seems that the torch has been passed on to Matt Miller and Andrew Reed, who are both barely 30 years old. In fact, Andrew actually worked on GitHub and Robinhood in his 20s. And as long as Sequoia keeps embracing the youth, they won't be losing their own youth anytime soon. Nowadays, there's a lot of VC firms out there that have hit it big, from Tiger Management to Andreessen Horowitz. But what sets apart Sequoia is their longevity. Most of the other VC firms have barely been around for 15 to 20 years, but Sequoia has been around for over 50. And the craziest part is that they were investing in leading-edge companies the entire time. They've literally had their hands in everything from Apple in the 1970s to SpaceX in the 2020s. Unfortunately, Don Valentine wasn't around to see this, as he passed away in late 2019 at age 87. But while Don is no longer with us, there's no question that his legacy and impact will live on for as long as the Sequoia tree itself. Were you familiar with Sequoia Capital? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you hope that your legacy lasts as long as the Sequoia tree. And of course, consider checking out our Discord community to suggest future video ideas, and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.